The sky over Astra Academy blazed with the light of 1,000 awakening souls. It was the most important day of the year, the day when the gates of destiny swung open or slammed shut for every 17-year-old within the kingdom's borders. The awakening ceremony, the day your worth was measured, quantified, and branded into your soul for the rest of your life. Siwoo stood at the very back of the line, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out uniform, while the other students around him adjusted their expensive tailored robes and polished their family crests. Siwoo's clothes were clean but faded, washed 100 times until the fabric had softened into something thin and tired. He didn't have a family crest. He didn't have a family at all. Just a small room in the commoners' quarter, and a dream that felt more ridiculous with every passing second. The courtyard of Astra Academy stretched before him like something out of a legend. Towering spires of white marble pierced the clouds, their surfaces etched with ancient runes that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, like the heartbeat of magic itself. Floating orbs drifted lazily between the archways, casting warm light over the thousands of students who had gathered from every corner of the continent. The children of dukes and duchesses stood in clusters, their laughter confident and loud. The merchant families kept to themselves, calculating and careful. And then there were the commoners, the ones like him, the ones who stood alone. Siwoo watched as a boy near the front of the line stepped up to the awakening stone. The moment his palm touched its surface, light exploded outward, a brilliant crimson that painted the entire courtyard in shades of fire. The massive crystal screen floating above the ceremony flickered once, twice, and then displayed the results for everyone to see. Kale Valerius Gift, Inferno Blade Rank, S. The crowd erupted. Gasps and cheers and whispers all tangled together into a single roar of awe. S-rank. The boy had barely touched the stone, and he'd already secured his place among the legends. Kale turned to the crowd with a practiced smile, the kind of smile that knew exactly how valuable it was. His family stood in the viewing stands, their applause measured and dignified, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. Siwoo felt something twist in his chest. Not jealousy, not exactly, it was something colder. The quiet acceptance that some people were born standing on mountaintops while the rest of you spent your entire life trying to climb. The ceremony continued. A girl with silver hair summoned a blizzard that frosted the stone beneath her feet. A rank, a boy with eyes like molten gold, called forth a shadow that devoured the light around him. S-rank, twins from the eastern provinces, touched the stone together, and the screen split in half to display two identical readings. Lyra and Ren Ashford Gift, Twin Resonance Rank, A. With every awakening, the gap between Siwoo and his dreams grew wider. He watched the noble children strut back to their families, their futures secure, their paths illuminated by the brilliance of their gifts. He watched the commoners who tested lower than they'd hoped force smiles onto their faces while their dreams crumbled behind their eyes. He watched one girl, just a farmer's daughter. He remembered seeing her in the market last week, stare at the screen as it displayed her F-rank assessment, watched her shoulders cave inward like a building collapsing from within. That's going to be me, Siwoo thought. In about 10 minutes, that's going to be me. But he didn't look away. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his hands steady in his pockets. If he was going to fall, he would fall with his eyes open. The line moved. The sun climbed higher. And finally, impossibly, it was his turn. Lei Siwoo. The herald's voice was flat, bored, just another commoner, just another name to check off the list. Siwoo stepped forward, and the crowd of noble students nearest to him didn't even bother to hide their smirks. They parted for him like he was something to step around, not someone to make room for. Good luck cleaning the bathrooms after this, someone muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. Laughter rippled through the group. Siwoo didn't react. He kept walking, his footsteps steady on the marble pathway that led to the awakening stone. The stone itself was massive, a monolith of crystalline rock that hummed with ancient power. It towered over him, easily twice his height, its surface smooth as glass and deep as infinity. He placed his palm against it. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd held its breath, not out of anticipation, out of expectation. Everyone knew what happened when a commoner touched the stone. Flickers, sparks, a brief, pitiful light that would mark them as D-rank or E-rank, suitable only for manual labor or support roles. The nobles watched the way cats watch wounded birds, waiting for the inevitable. But then something changed. The stone began to glow. At first it was faint, a soft luminescence deep within the crystal, like the first light of dawn creeping over a mountain. Siwoo felt warmth spread through his palm, up his arm, into his chest. It wasn't painful. It felt like coming home after a very long time away. The light grew brighter. The murmuring in the crowd began to shift. This wasn't a flicker. This wasn't a spark. This was something else, something that made the stone hum louder, made the runes on the nearby pillars pulse in response. And then it happened. From the surface of the stone, something emerged. It pushed through the crystalline barrier like a swimmer breaking the surface of a lake, except it wasn't flesh and blood. It was metal, rusted, ancient, broken metal. A stopwatch emerged from the stone, hanging in the air before Siwoo on a chain that looked like it had spent centuries buried in the earth. The glass face was cracked. The hands were frozen. The silver casing was tarnished almost to black. The stopwatch hung there for one perfect moment, and then it dropped into Siwoo's waiting palm. Silence. Absolute, complete, deafening silence. Siwoo stared at the object in his hand. It was cold, heavy, dead. The hands didn't move. The crack across the face caught the light and threw it back in strange, broken patterns. He could feel something inside it, something vast and still and waiting, but he couldn't reach it, couldn't touch it, couldn't wake it up. The crystal screen above flickered to life. Every eye in the courtyard turned to it. The noble children, the merchants, the commoners, the instructors, even the headmaster, ancient and unshakable, leaned forward in his seat. The screen flickered once, twice, 3 times, and then it displayed the result. Lee Siwoo gift, broken stopwatch rank, F. For a single heartbeat there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no breath. And then the laughter began. It started small, a snort from somewhere in the crowd, quickly smothered. Then another louder. Then a cascade, a waterfall, a tsunami of mocking laughter that crashed over Siwoo and threatened to drown him where he stood. The noble children doubled over, clutching their stomachs. The merchants shook their heads, already calculating how to distance themselves from this embarrassment. Even some of the commoners laughed, grateful that someone else had drawn the shortest straw, that the spotlight of humiliation had landed on someone else for once. A stopwatch. He awakened a stopwatch. Look at it, it's broken. He's literally F-rank with a broken piece of junk. I've never seen anything so pathetic in all my years. Not even D-rank, not even E-rank. F, the lowest of the low. Siwoo stood frozen at the stone, the stopwatch clutched in his trembling hand. He could feel the weight of every stare, every whisper, every laugh. They carved into him like knives, each one sharper than the last. He wanted to move. He wanted to run. He wanted to disappear into the earth and never come back. But his legs wouldn't obey. The herald cleared his throat, his face carefully neutral. Step aside, please. You're blocking the next candidate. Siwoo stumbled away from the stone. He didn't remember walking back through the crowd. He didn't remember the way they parted for him again, this time with exaggerated care, as if his F-rank was contagious. He didn't remember reaching the edge of the courtyard, finding a shadow to stand in, pressing his back against the cool marble of a pillar. All he remembered was the stopwatch in his hand, heavy, dead, useless. His gift, the thing that was supposed to define his future. He looked at it closely for the first time. The rust was thick on the casing, flacking off onto his palm in orange-brown scales. The glass face was spiderwebbed with cracks, and behind those cracks, the hands were frozen, stuck, just like him, stuck at the bottom with no way to move up. Hey, janitor! Siwoo looked up. A group of noble students stood a few feet away, led by the S-rank boy from earlier, Kale Valerius. His smile was friendly, but his eyes were anything but. Since you're F-rank, Kale said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, you'll probably be assigned to maintenance, right? Make sure you clean the training grounds well. We wouldn't want anyone to slip on monster guts and hurt themselves. His friends laughed. Of course they laughed. Siwoo said nothing. He couldn't speak. His voice was trapped somewhere deep inside him, buried under the weight of everything that had just happened. Kale's smile widened. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or did your broken watch finally stop working altogether? He glanced at the stopwatch in Siwoo's hand and shook his head in mock sympathy. Honestly, I've never seen anything so tragic. You should just give up now. Save yourself the trouble. Some people are born to be heroes, and some people are born to hold mops. That's just the way the world works. He clapped Siwoo on the shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly from a distance, but was just firm enough to be a threat up close, and walked away, his friends trailing behind him like loyal dogs. Siwoo stood alone, in the shadow of the pillar. The ceremony continued behind him. More awakenings, more lights, more cheers. The screen above flickered with new names, new ranks, new destinies being written, but for Siwoo, the world had gone quiet, hollow, empty. He looked at the stopwatch again. Why had the stone given him this? Why had it glowed so brightly if this was all there was? The warmth he'd felt, that sense of coming home, had it all been in his head, a trick of his desperate, dreaming heart? He turned the stopwatch over in his palm. The back was even more rusted than the front, but there, barely visible beneath the corrosion, was an inscription. He squinted at it, tracing the letters with his finger. To the one who winds eternity. Siwoo stared at the words for a long moment. Wind eternity. What did that even mean? How could you wind something that was already broken? How could you fix something that had been rusting for what looked like centuries? A droplet of water landed on the glass face. Siwoo looked up. The sky had clouded over while he wasn't paying attention. Rain was coming. Of course it was, because today wasn't humiliating enough. Today wasn't painful enough. Today needed rain to wash the tears from your face before anyone could see them. He shoved the stopwatch into his pocket and walked away from the ceremony. No one noticed him leave. No one ever noticed him leave. Behind him, the awakening stone pulsed once, a brief flash of light that no one saw, a brief moment of acknowledgement for the soul it had just released. But the stone was old, and the stone was wise, and it knew something that the humans in their arrogance could never understand. Gifts weren't about what you could do today. Gifts were about what you could become tomorrow. And the boy with the broken stopwatch, the boy they had all laughed at, the boy who walked away from the ceremony with his head down and his shoulders curved inward, that boy carried a power so vast, so ancient, so impossibly rare that the stone itself had trembled when he touched it. But the stone couldn't speak, and Siwoo couldn't hear. He walked through the emptying courtyard, past the clusters of celebrating families, past the servants cleaning up after the ceremony, past the gates of Astra Academy, and into the city beyond. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and thin, against his skin. In his pocket, the stopwatch sat heavy and still. Dead. Useless. Broken. The rain fell harder. Siwoo didn't run. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, back toward his small room in the commoner's quarter, back toward the life he'd always known, back toward the dream that had just died. He didn't see the stopwatch's hands move. Just once, just a fraction of a millimeter, just enough to know that eternity was waiting. But Siwoo didn't see. Not yet. The rain washed over him as he disappeared into the gray streets of the city, a small figure swallowed by the storm, carrying a power he couldn't comprehend, a destiny he couldn't escape, and a broken stopwatch that had just begun to tick. Chapter 2, The First Tick of Eternity. The rain continued to fall over the commoner's quarter, long after Siwoo had locked himself inside his small room. It wasn't much, this room. 4 walls of grey stone, a single window that faced a narrow alley, a bed that sagged in the middle, and a desk that had seen better decades. The rent was cheap, cheaper than cheap, because the landlord knew that only the desperate would live in a place where the walls sweated moisture in the summer and froze solid in the winter. Siwoo had lived here for 3 years, ever since the orphanage had aged him out at 14, and in all that time, he had never once had a visitor. Tonight, he was grateful for that. He sat on the edge of his bed, the stopwatch clutched in both hands, staring at it with the kind of intensity that could bore holes through steel. The rain drummed against his window in a steady, relentless rhythm. The single candle on his desk flickered with each draft that slipped through the cracks in the walls. Broken, he whispered to himself. You're just broken. The stopwatch didn't answer. Of course it didn't. It was a piece of metal and glass, ancient and rusted and dead. What had he expected? For it to suddenly start working, for the hands to move and reveal that today had all been some terrible mistake. Siwoo laughed, and the sound was hollow in the small room. The lowest of the low. He'd known intellectually that this was a possibility. Commoners didn't usually awaken high-rank gifts. The magic favored bloodlines, favored centuries of careful breeding and accumulated wealth. The great families had been marrying each other for generations, concentrating power until it flowed through their veins like liquid fire. Commoners got the scraps, the leftovers, the gifts that weren't quite strong enough to be useful. But S-rank. He turned the stopwatch over in his palm, tracing the inscription again with his thumb. To the one who winds eternity. Such grand words for such a useless object. Whoever had written them must have been mocking the recipient, or maybe the stopwatch had been beautiful once, before time had eaten away at it, before the rust had claimed its surface and the crack had split its face. Siwoo lifted it to his ear. Nothing, no ticking, no movement, just silence. He set it on his desk beside the candle and lay back on his bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Tomorrow, he would report to the academy's administrative office. They would assign him a role, probably maintenance, like Kale had said. He would spend his days cleaning up after the real students, the ones with actual gifts, the ones who would become hunters and heroes and legends. He would watch them train and grow and rise, and he would mop up their sweat and their blood and their monster guts. And he would fade into the background until one day, no one remembered he'd ever existed at all. The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down his temples and into his hair. He didn't wipe them away. Morning came gray and cold. Siwoo hadn't slept. He'd lain awake all night, watching the candle burn down to nothing, watching the darkness press against his window, watching the stopwatch sit motionless on his desk. At some point, he'd stopped crying. The tears had dried, leaving salt tracks on his skin, and something hard had formed in his chest, something cold and determined. He would survive. That was what commoners did. They survived. He washed his face in the basin, changed into his cleanest set of clothes, still worn, still faded, but presentable, and picked up the stopwatch. For a moment, he considered leaving it behind, throwing it away, forgetting this whole humiliating experience had ever happened. But he didn't. He slipped it into his pocket, where it hung heavy against his thigh, and he walked out the door. Astro Academy looked different in the morning light. The rain had washed the city clean, leaving everything sparkling and fresh. The marble towers gleamed like polished bone. The floating orbs dimmed as the sun rose, their light unnecessary now. Students hurried between buildings, their robes crisp and their faces bright with the excitement of a new term. Siwoo walked among them like a ghost. No one spoke to him, no one looked at him. He was invisible, and he clung to that invisibility like a shield. The administrative office was in the base of the central tower, a sprawling complex of desks and clerks and endless stacks of paperwork. Siwoo waited in line behind a dozen other students, most of them commoners like him, all of them wearing the same expression of resigned acceptance. When his turn came, he stepped up to the desk and presented his identification. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with spectacles perched on her nose, scanned his papers and frowned. Lee Siwoo, S-rank, broken stopwatch. She looked up at him over her spectacles. Unusual gift. I've been told, Siwoo said quietly. She made a note on his file. Maintenance division. You'll report to the training grounds supervisor. Cleaning duties, equipment maintenance, waste disposal. Hours are 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening with a 1-hour break for meals. You'll receive a stipend, small but enough to live on. Dormitory housing is available if you want it. I have housing. Your choice. She stamped his papers and handed them back. Report to Supervisor Chen at the East Training Grounds. Don't be late. Siwoo took the papers and left. The East Training Grounds were exactly what he'd expected. A massive open field, ringed by spectator stands, scarred by months of combat practice. The grass was patchy at best, replaced in large swathes by bare earth and stone. Targets lined the far wall, some intact, some shattered. Weapons racks stood at intervals along the perimeter, filled with practice swords and training spears. And everywhere there was blood. Not human blood, monster blood, dark and thick and sticky, splattered across the ground in patterns that told stories of desperate fights and narrow escapes. The training grounds were where students practiced against captured beasts, where they learned to kill before they faced the real thing in the dungeons beyond the city walls. And it was Siwoo's job to clean it up. Supervisor Chen was a bear of a man with a shaved head and arms like tree trunks. He looked Siwoo up and down with undisguised contempt. F-rank, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Ever cleaned before? Yes, sir, at the orphanage. Good, you'll start with the south quadrant. Mop, bucket, disinfectant. There's a storage shed at the edge of the field. Get to work. Siwoo got to work. The morning passed in a blur of repetitive motion. Fill the bucket, add the disinfectant, mop the blood, rinse the mop, fill the bucket again. The work was mindless, exhausting, and strangely soothing. It required no thought, no emotion, no investment, just movement, just survival. Other maintenance workers moved around him, other F-ranks, other E-ranks, the rejects and the forgotten. They didn't speak to each other. There was no camaraderie among the fallen, just the shared understanding that they were here and the others were there, and never the twain would meet. At noon, Siwoo sat alone under a tree and ate the simple meal he'd brought from home. Rice and vegetables, cold but filling. He watched the students training in the main field, the S-ranks and A-ranks, the ones with futures. Kale was there, his inferno blade leaving trails of fire in the air. The silver-haired girl from the ceremony was there too, her ice magic sparkling in the sunlight. They moved like dancers, like warriors, like people who had never doubted their place in the world. Siwoo looked away. In his pocket, the stopwatch sat heavy and still. The afternoon brought new challenges. A practical combat session in the south quadrant had left the ground covered in more than just blood. Something had been torn apart, some kind of beast, from the look of it, and pieces of it had been scattered across a wide area. Siwoo's job was to collect the pieces, bag them for disposal, and then clean the blood. He worked methodically, his face carefully blank. The other students ignored him, which was fine, expected, normal. Until one of them didn't. "Hey, janitor." Siwoo looked up. A group of students had gathered near the edge of the quadrant, fresh from their training. At their center was a boy Siwoo recognized, Kyle, the A-rank noble from the ceremony, the one who had mocked him in front of everyone. Kyle's smile was wide and cruel. "I remember you, the broken stopwatch guy. How's maintenance treating you?" Siwoo said nothing. He picked up another piece of monster remains and dropped it into his bag. "Oh, don't be like that." Kyle sauntered closer, his friends spreading out behind him like a hunting pack. "I'm just making conversation. We're all students here, right? Even if some of us are more equal than others." His friends laughed. Siwoo kept working. Kyle's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being ignored. He stepped closer, close enough that Siwoo could smell the expensive soap he used, close enough that his shadow fell across Siwoo's work. "I'm talking to you." Siwoo straightened. He looked Kyle in the eyes for the first time. "I heard you, I just don't have anything to say." Something flickered in Kyle's expression. Surprise, maybe, that an F-rank would dare to speak to him like that, that the lowest of the low would meet his gaze instead of cowering. The surprise hardened into anger. "You know," Kyle said, his voice dropping to something soft and dangerous, "my father owns half the contracts for dungeon cleanup in this city. One word from me, and you're out of a job. One word, and you're back on the street, begging for scraps." Siwoo felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, something harder. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Kyle smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "You're nothing, janitor. You're F-rank. You're garbage. The only reason you're allowed to breathe the same air as us is because someone has to clean up our messes. Don't forget your place." He held Siwoo's gaze for a long moment, making sure the message landed, and then he turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him like shadows. Siwoo stood frozen, the bag of monster parts hanging from his hand, the weight of Kyle's words pressing down on him like a physical force. He wanted to scream, he wanted to fight, he wanted to do something, anything, that would prove he wasn't nothing, that he wasn't garbage, that he deserved more than this. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because Kyle was right. Siwoo was F-rank, he was nothing, he was garbage, and the only thing keeping him alive was his willingness to accept that truth and keep moving forward. He turned back to his work. The afternoon stretched on. The attack came at sunset. Siwoo was alone in the south quadrant, finishing up the last of his cleaning, when he heard the screaming. It came from the main training field, high and sharp and full of terror. Siwoo's head snapped up, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He dropped his mop and ran toward the sound, his feet pounding against the blood-stained earth. What he saw when he reached the main field made his blood run cold. A rift, a massive, tearing wound in the fabric of reality itself, hanging in the air above the training grounds like a screaming mouth. It was easily 20 feet across, its edges crackling with purple energy, and from within its depths, things were emerging. Monsters, dozens of them. They poured through the rift like water through a broken dam, twisted creatures with too many limbs and too many teeth, their bodies wreathed in shadow, their eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. High-rank demons, the kind that should never appear within city walls, the kind that meant death. Students scattered in every direction. Some fought, the S-ranks and A-ranks, the ones with real power, but they were caught off guard, unprepared, overwhelmed by the suddenness of the attack. Kale's inferno blade carved through one demon, then another, but for every one he killed, 3 more took its place. And in the center of it all, frozen in terror, was a single student. A girl, young, commoner from the look of her plain clothes. She'd been caught in the open when the rift opened, and now she stood motionless as a demon lunged toward her, its claws extended, its jaws gaping wide. No one was close enough to save her. No one except Siwoo. He ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't calculate the odds or consider the consequences. He just ran, his legs pumping, his heart hammering, his entire being focused on that single point of intersection where the girl's life hung in the balance. The demon was faster. It was going to reach her first. Siwoo was still 20 feet away when the demon's claws began their final descent, when the girl's scream died in her throat, when everything slowed down to that single, terrible moment. And then the stopwatch clicked. The sound was soft, barely audible above the chaos, but to Siwoo, it was everything. The world stopped, not figuratively, not emotionally, literally, completely, absolutely. The demon froze mid-lunge, its claws inches from the girl's face. The girl froze mid-scream, her eyes wide, her mouth open. Behind them, the battle froze, Kale with his sword raised, the silver-haired girl with ice forming around her hands, the demons with their teeth bared and their claws extended. Even the light froze, hanging in the air like a photograph. Everything was still. Everything was silent. Everything was gray. And Siwoo could move. He stumbled forward, his legs suddenly weak, his head spinning. What was this? What was happening? He looked down at his hand and saw the stopwatch clutched in his fingers, and for the first time he saw its hands move. Just once, just a single tick forward. Time was passing, slowly, incrementally, but passing nonetheless. He didn't know how long he had. Seconds, maybe, heartbeats. He had to move, he had to. The girl. He looked up. The demon was frozen, yes, but its claws were still aimed at her face. When time resumed, she would die, unless Siwoo moved. He ran to the girl, grabbed her arm and pulled. She was heavier than she looked, frozen solid, immovable. He strained against her weight, against the unnatural stillness of the frozen world, and slowly, agonizingly, he dragged her out of the demon's path. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15. He kept going until they were clear, until the demon's lunge would carry it past them instead of through them, and then he collapsed, his body screaming with exhaustion, his vision swimming. The stopwatch clicked again. Time resumed. The demon's claws slashed through empty air. The girl stumbled forward, released from her frozen state, and fell to her knees. Behind them, the battle continued, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just stopped and started again. But something had changed. The girl looked around wildly, her eyes landing on Siwoo. He was on the ground, gasping for breath, his face pale, his body trembling. She hadn't seen what happened. No one had. But she knew, somehow she knew, that he was the reason she was still alive. "You," she started. A demon roared behind them. Siwoo forced himself to his feet. "Run," he gasped. "Run." She ran. He ran too, stumbling away from the battle, away from the rift, away from everything. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the training grounds, until he'd put enough distance between himself and the chaos that he could breathe again. He collapsed against a wall, his heart pounding, his body shaking, his mind reeling. The stopwatch. He looked at it again. It sat in his palm, rusted and cracked, exactly as it had been before. But now he knew, now he understood. It wasn't broken. It had never been broken. It had been waiting. Siwoo stared at the stopwatch, as the sounds of battle faded behind him, as sirens began to wail in the distance, as the city mobilized to respond to the attack. He stared at it, and he saw, for the first time, what it truly was. Not junk, not garbage, not a broken piece of metal from a forgotten time. A gift, his gift. And it was only just beginning to wake up. Chapter 3, The System's Cruel Diagnosis. The night swallowed Astra Academy whole. Siwoo didn't remember walking home. One moment he was leaning against that wall at the edge of the training grounds, his body shaking, his mind blank with shock, and the next, he was sitting on his bed in the commoner's quarter, the stopwatch still clutched in his hand, the candle on his desk already burned down to a stub. Hours had passed, he had no memory of them. The attack, the rift, the demon lunging toward that girl, and then the click, the world freezing, the impossible, world-shattering moment when time itself had bent to his will. Had it really happened? Siwoo looked at the stopwatch. It sat in his palm, rusted and dead, exactly as it had been before. The hands hadn't moved since that single tick forward. The crack across its face hadn't healed. It looked exactly like the useless piece of junk everyone believed it to be. But he knew. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd felt. The question was, what did it mean? He turned the stopwatch over, reading the inscription again by the dying light of the candle. To the one who winds eternity. Wind eternity. Was that what he'd done? Had he wounded it somehow? He hadn't done anything consciously, just run toward the danger, just wanted to save that girl, just felt the desperate need to move faster than the world would allow. And the stopwatch had answered. But at what cost? His body ached, not the normal ache of physical labor, but something deeper, a hollow emptiness, as if part of him had been scooped out and thrown away. His head throbbed with a pain that pulsed behind his eyes. His hands trembled when he tried to hold them still. Using the stopwatch had taken something from him. He just didn't know what. The next morning, Siwoo reported for work as usual. The academy was different now. Guards patrolled the corridors in full armor. Instructors moved with visible tension, their eyes scanning constantly for threats. Students walked in groups, their conversations hushed, their faces pale. The rift had been closed. The headmaster himself had done it, according to the rumors, but the fear remained. No one mentioned the girl. No one mentioned the F-rank janitor, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one mentioned anything at all. Siwoo collected his mop and bucket and headed for the south quadrant. The blood from yesterday's attack had been cleaned up overnight, someone else's shift, probably, but there was new work waiting, always new work. He was halfway across the training grounds when he felt it. A gaze heavy, intentional, watching him. He turned slowly, his heart rate accelerating despite himself. Standing at the edge of the field, partially hidden in the shadow of a pillar, was a figure he didn't recognize. Old, ancient, even with skin like parchment and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. She wore the robes of a scholar, but not like any Siwoo had seen before. These were faded, threadbare, covered in symbols that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly. The librarian. He didn't know how he knew, he just did. She stared at him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Siwoo stood frozen, his mop forgotten in his hand. What had that been about? 3 days passed. 3 days of work and exhaustion and endless, gnawing questions. 3 days of staring at the stopwatch every night, willing it to do something, anything, that would prove he hadn't imagined the whole thing. 3 days of nothing. The stopwatch remained dead. Siwoo began to doubt himself. Had it really happened? Or had his mind invented the whole thing, some kind of stress-induced hallucination, a coping mechanism for the terror of that moment? The girl he'd saved was alive. He'd seen her in the dining hall, eating with friends, laughing as if nothing had happened. She never looked at him, never acknowledged him. Maybe she didn't remember. Maybe it had all been a dream. But the hollow ache in his chest remained, and the stopwatch remained in his pocket, heavy and silent, waiting. On the 4th day, everything changed. Siwoo was cleaning the main corridor outside the grand lecture hall when he heard footsteps behind him, fast, purposeful, coming straight toward him. He turned. It was the girl, the one he'd saved. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 15, with a round face and wide eyes that held a desperate intensity. She grabbed his arm before he could react, pulling him into a small alcove hidden behind a statue. "I know what you did," she whispered. Siwoo's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Her grip on his arm tightened. "The attack, the demon. I was going to die. I know I was going to die. I felt its claws starting to cut into my skin." And then she shook her head. "I don't know what happened. One second it was there, and the next I was on the ground 10 feet away, and you were on the ground too, looking like you just run a marathon." "You tripped," Siwoo said automatically. "You must have." "I didn't trip." Her voice was fierce. "I've been trained since I was old enough to walk. I know what a stumble feels like. That wasn't it. Something moved me, and you were the only one close enough to do it." Siwoo said nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs. The girl studied his face for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "I'm not going to tell anyone. I don't know what you did or how you did it, but you saved my life. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." She released his arm and stepped back. "My name is Yuna. If you ever need help, if you ever need anything, find me. I'm in the healing arts department. I'm not much yet, but I'm learning." She turned to Lave, then paused. "Whatever your gift really is, be careful. There are people in this academy who would kill for power they don't understand." And then she was gone, disappearing into the stream of students flowing through the corridor. Siwoo stood frozen in the alcove, his mind racing. She knew not everything, but enough, and she'd kept his secret. For now. That night, Siwoo made a decision. He couldn't keep going like this, working by day, lying awake by night, drowning in questions with no answers. If his gift was real, he needed to understand it, needed to know what it was, how it worked, why it had chosen him. And there was only one place in Astra Academy where those answers might exist. The Forbidden Archives. Every student knew about them. A section of the library so restricted that even most instructors couldn't access it. A place where ancient knowledge was stored, knowledge about gifts that predated the current system, about powers that had been lost to time, about things that the academy didn't want its students to know. Getting in was impossible, but Siwoo had learned something in his years as an orphan, as a commoner, as someone invisible. He'd learned that impossible just meant you hadn't found the right angle yet. It took him a week to prepare. A week of watching the library's patrol patterns. A week of memorizing the guards' schedules, the rotation of the magical wards, the moments when the security systems flickered and reset. A week of gathering supplies, a length of rope, a set of lock picks he'd traded his month's food stipend for, a small vial of light-attracting essence that would distract the enchanted sentinels. A week of the stopwatch sitting in his pocket, silent and waiting. On the night of his planned infiltration, the sky was overcast. No moon, no stars, just thick clouds that swallowed all light. Siwoo slipped out of his room at midnight and made his way through the sleeping city toward the academy. The walls were easy to climb. He'd done it before, back when he was younger and stupider, back when he still believed that sneaking into the academy at night would somehow change his fate. Now he did it with practiced ease, his fingers finding holds in the old stone, his body moving like shadow. The library was a massive structure at the academy's heart, its towers reaching toward the sky like grasping hands. Siwoo approached from the east, keeping to the darkest paths, pausing whenever a patrol passed. He counted their steps, their timing, their patterns, just as he'd done every night for the past week. The main entrance was impossible. Too many guards, too many wards. But the roof had a skylight that no one ever watched. Getting to the roof required climbing skills Siwoo didn't know he had. He scrambled up drain pipes, across ledges, along narrow stone outcroppings that crumbled under his weight. More than once he nearly fell, his heart lurching into his throat, his fingers scraping bloody against the rough stone. But he made it. The skylight was old, ancient, really, its frame rusted, its glass clouded with years of accumulated grime. Siwoo worked his lock picks into the mechanism, his breath misting in the cold air, his hands steady despite everything. Click! The latch released. He slid the skylight open and dropped into darkness below. The Forbidden Archives weren't what he'd expected. No elaborate traps, no guardian monsters, no walls of flame or fields of deadly magic. just rows and rows of shelves, stretching into infinite darkness, filled with books so old they seemed to breathe with the weight of centuries. Siwoo stood in the center of it all, turning slowly, trying to take it in. Where was he supposed to start? What was he even looking for? He walked through the stacks, trailing his fingers along the spines of books, reading titles that made no sense to him. Treatise on the classification of temporal anomalies, the chronomancer's lament, a history of sealed gifts across 7 kingdoms. Temporal chronomancer, time. His heart beat faster. He pulled a book from the shelf, the chronomancer's lament, and carried it to a small reading desk in the corner. The pages were brittle, crumbling at the edges, but the text was still legible. He read by the light of a small glowstone he'd brought, its soft illumination just enough to make out the words. What he read made his blood run cold. The chronomancers were an ancient order, so ancient that even the oldest records referred to them as legends. They wielded power over time itself, manipulating its flow in ways that modern gift users couldn't even imagine. They could pause moments, accelerate their own movements, reverse wounds, glimpse the future. They were said to be invincible, unstoppable, closer to gods than to men. And they were all dead. Every single one. The book didn't explain how or why, just that the last chronomancer had vanished 500 years ago, and with him, the secret of temporal magic had died. The gifts that remained, the ones that touched time in even the smallest way, were so rare that most scholars believed they didn't exist at all. Siwoo closed the book, his hands trembling. A chronomancer, was that what he was? Was that what the stopwatch meant? He needed more, needed confirmation, needed to understand. He searched the shelves desperately, pulling book after book, scanning page after page. Most of them were useless, histories of dead kingdoms, records of forgotten wars, treatises on magical theory that might as well have been written in another language. But then he found it. Hidden in a corner, covered in dust so thick it looked like fur, was a device. Small, ancient, made of the same kind of metal as his stopwatch. An appraisal device. Siwoo's breath caught in his throat. He'd heard rumors of these machines that could analyze gifts with perfect accuracy, revealing truths that the standard assessment stones couldn't detect. They were supposed to be extinct, lost, destroyed. But here it was. He reached out with shaking hands and placed the stopwatch on the device's surface. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the device began to glow. Light erupted from its core, brilliant, blinding, impossible. It illuminated the entire archive, casting long shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The air hummed with power. The books on the shelves trembled. And then, projected into the air above the device, words appeared. SSS-rank, temporal relic detected. Classification, chronomancer's legacy, the eternal stopwatch. Synchronization, 0%. Warning, current host body incompatible with relic's power output. F-rank classification is artificial IMPOSCD to prevent immediate host termination. To increase synchronization, the relic must be wounded. To wind the relic, the host must confront extreme danger and absorb temporal energy released during life-threatening moments. Warning, each winding may cause catastrophic physical damage. Host survival not guaranteed. Warning, if synchronization reaches 100%, the relic's true power will be unlocked. The nature of this power is unknown. Warning, the relic is sentient. The relic is watching. The relic is waiting. The words hung in the air for one long, terrible moment. And then they vanished. The light died. The archive plunged back into darkness. Siwoo stood frozen, his mind reeling, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. SSS-rank. His gift was SSS-rank, the highest classification possible, rarer than anything, more powerful than anything, a relic from a dead order, from a forgotten age, from a time when chronomancers walked the earth and bent time to their will. And he was synchronized at 0%. 0, which meant he wasn't even scratching the surface of what this gift could do, which meant the moment he'd stopped time, that impossible, world-shattering moment, had been nothing, a fraction of the stopwatch's true potential. But the warnings, current host body incompatible, that was why the scanner had labeled him F-rank, not because his gift was weak, but because it was too strong, too powerful for his mortal body to handle. The Academy's system had read the danger and classified him accordingly, protecting him from a power that would kill him if unleashed too quickly. And the only way to grow stronger, to increase his synchronization, was to face death. Over and over, to throw himself into danger, to absorb the temporal energy released in those life-or-death moments, to wind the stopwatch one tick at a time, knowing that each time might be his last. Siwoo stared at the stopwatch in his palm. It looked the same as always, rusted, cracked, dead, but now he knew, now he understood. It wasn't broken. It was waiting for him to be strong enough to use it, waiting for him to prove himself worthy of its power, waiting for him to wind eternity itself. He closed his fingers around it, feeling its weight, its warmth, its impossible presence. "I understand now," he whispered into the darkness. "I understand." The stopwatch didn't respond, but deep within its ancient mechanism, something shifted, something stirred. Something that had been sleeping for 500 years began, at last, to wake. Siwoo left the forbidden archives the same way he'd entered, climbing back through the skylight, descending the walls, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. He made it back to his room just before dawn, collapsing onto his bed, his body exhausted but his mind racing. He had a path now, a dangerous path, a deadly path, a path that would push him to his limits and beyond. But it was his path, and he would walk it, no matter what it cost. The next morning, Siwoo reported for work as usual, but something had changed. The other maintenance workers noticed it, a new energy in his movements, a new light in his eyes. He worked faster, harder, with purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was preparing. And when the notice went up that afternoon, volunteers NEEDED, low-grade dungeon CLENUP crew, danger level, moderate, compensation, increased stipend for 1 month, Siwoo was the first to sign his name. The clerk looked at him with surprise. "You sure about this? Cleanup crews go in after the hunters clear the dungeon, but sometimes things get left behind. It's dangerous." Siwoo met his eyes. "I know. And you still want to go?" "Yes." The clerk shrugged and stamped the form. "Suit yourself. Report to the dungeon gate at dawn tomorrow. Don't be late." Siwoo took the form and walked away, the stopwatch heavy in his pocket. Dawn tomorrow. His first real test. His first chance to wind eternity. He didn't know if he would survive, but for the first time since the awakening ceremony, he didn't care, because he finally had a reason to try. Chapter 4. The Dungeon of Despair. Dawn came cold and grey. Siwoo stood at the dungeon gate with a dozen other volunteers, commoners like him, F-ranks and E-ranks, people who needed the extra stipend enough to risk their lives in the cleanup crews. They didn't speak to each other. There was nothing to say. They were here because they had to be, not because they wanted to be. The dungeon loomed before them, a massive stone archway set into the base of a hill, its surface covered in warning runes that pulsed with dull red light. Beyond the arch, darkness waited, impenetrable, hungry. The team leader arrived moments before they were scheduled to enter. He was an S-rank hunter named Jiho, a tall man with kind eyes and the easy confidence of someone who had faced death 100 times and always walked away. He looked over the volunteers with an expression that might have been pity. "All right," he said, "here's how this works. The dungeon's been cleared of major threats, but that doesn't mean it's safe. Goblins breed fast. Sometimes we miss a nest. Sometimes things get left behind." He looked at each of them in turn. "You stay close to me, you do exactly what I say, and if something goes wrong, you run, understood?" Nods all around. Jiho's gaze lingered on Siwoo for a moment, something flickering in his eyes, recognition maybe, or curiosity. Then he turned and led them into the darkness. The dungeon was worse than Siwoo had imagined. The tunnels were narrow, claustrophobic, their walls slick with moisture that gleamed in the light of the mage lanterns they carried. The air smelled of rot and something else, something metallic that made his stomach turn. Sounds echoed from everywhere and nowhere, drips of water, scuttling movements in the darkness, distant howls that might have been wind or might have been something else. They moved deeper. The first hour passed without incident. They collected monster remains, bagged them for disposal, marked cleared areas on Jiho's map. The work was grim but straightforward. Siwoo stayed close to the others, his hand never far from the stopwatch in his pocket. He was waiting, watching, ready. The second hour brought the first sign of trouble. They found a body. One of the original hunters, a man in battered armor, his throat torn out, his eyes staring at nothing. He'd been dead for days, maybe weeks. The goblins hadn't bothered to eat him. Jiho knelt beside the body, his expression grim. This shouldn't be here. The cleanup crew was supposed to recover all the fallen. Maybe they missed him, someone suggested. Maybe, Jiho stood, his hand moving to the weapon at his hip. Or maybe they never made it this far. As if summoned by his words, the howling began. It came from everywhere, from the tunnels ahead, from the tunnels behind, from the walls themselves. A chorus of high-pitched shrieks that raised the hair on Siwoo's neck and sent ice water through his veins. Goblins, Jiho breathed. A lot of them. They came from the darkness like a tide. Dozens of them, hundreds, small and twisted and fast, their eyes gleaming with malice, their claws reaching, their teeth gnashing. They poured from side tunnels, from cracks in the walls, from places that shouldn't have existed. The volunteers screamed. Jiho moved. He was S-rank for a reason. His sword flashed in the lantern light, each stroke taking multiple goblins, his movements so fast they were almost invisible. For a moment, it seemed like he might hold them back, might actually turn the tide. But there were too many. They swarmed past him, around him, through him. They reached the volunteers, claws tore flesh, teeth found throats, blood sprayed across the tunnel walls. People died. Siwoo watched a woman, a mother she'd mentioned earlier, working to feed her children, fall beneath a pile of goblins. He watched a young man, barely older than himself, try to run and get dragged down from behind. He watched the tunnel fill with screams and blood and death. And then he saw Jiho. The S-rank hunter was surrounded. A dozen goblins pressed against him, forcing him back, forcing him to defend instead of attack. Behind them, a larger goblin, a hobgoblin, Siwoo's mind supplied, stronger, faster, smarter, was positioning itself for a killing blow. Jiho didn't see it. He was too focused on the ones in front of him. The hobgoblin raised a crude spear, its tip aimed at Jiho's back. Time seemed to slow. Siwoo saw everything, the arc of the spear, the path it would take, the exact moment when it would pierce Jiho's spine. He saw the hunter's death written in the air, inevitable and absolute. And something inside him snapped. The stopwatch clicked. The world froze. Siwoo moved. He ran through the frozen chaos, past goblins caught mid-lunge, past falling bodies suspended in air, past sprays of blood that hung like red crystals in the gray light. His body screamed with the effort. 3 seconds. He had 3 seconds, maybe less. He reached Jiho. He grabbed the hunter's arm. He pulled. The hobgoblin's spear passed through empty air where Jiho's back had been a moment before. It clattered against the tunnel wall, harmless. Time resumed. Jiho stumbled, off balance, confused. What? Duck, Siwoo screamed. Jiho ducked. A goblin's claws raked the air above his head. He spun, sword flashing, and the goblin fell. But there were still so many. Siwoo's vision swam. The stopwatch had taken everything from him, every reserve of strength, every drop of energy. He couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but watch as the goblins closed in. Then Jiho was there. The hunter stood over him, sword moving in arcs of light, cutting down goblin after goblin. His face was set in grim determination, but his eyes held something else. Wonder, disbelief, understanding. Hold on, Jiho said. Just hold on. He fought, and fought, and fought. When reinforcements finally arrived, hunters from the surface, responding to Jiho's emergency signal, they found a scene of carnage. Dozens of goblins dead, the hobgoblins slain, the surviving volunteers huddled together at the tunnel's end. And in the center of it all, Jiho knelt beside an unconscious boy, protecting him with his own body, refusing to let anyone near until he was sure the danger had passed. Siwoo woke in the medical wing. Again, the ceiling was the same white as before. The smell was the same, antiseptic and magic, and something sterile. His body ached in ways he hadn't known were possible. But he was alive, and the stopwatch was still in his pocket. He reached for it with trembling fingers, pulled it out, looked at it. The hands hadn't moved. The rust hadn't changed. It looked exactly as it always had. But he knew. 3 seconds. He'd held the world frozen for 3 seconds, longer than before, stronger than before. The cost had been immense. He could feel it in every cell of his body, but he'd done it. He'd saved a life. He'd wound the stopwatch a little more. The door opened. Ji-ho stepped in. He looked different now, tired, haunted, but also something else, something that might have been awe. "You're awake," he said. "Good, the healers said you might not." He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind, you're awake, that's what matters." Siwoo tried to sit up, failed, settled for turning his head. The others. Ji-ho's face tightened. 7 dead, 3 wounded. You and me and 2 others made it out without major injuries. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down heavily. "We would have all died if not for you." Siwoo said nothing. "I saw what you did." Ji-ho's voice was quiet, careful. "I didn't understand it at first. One moment I was about to die, and the next I was somewhere else, and the spear that should have killed me was gone. I thought I'd imagined it, hallucinated. But then I saw you collapse, and I knew." He leaned forward, meeting Siwoo's eyes. "You stopped time. Somehow, someway, you stopped time and moved me out of the way. That's not an F-rank gift. That's not even an S-rank gift. That's something else entirely." Siwoo's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," Ji-ho's voice was firm but not unkind. "Don't lie to me, not after you saved my life. Whatever you are, whatever your gift really is, I owe you, and I keep my debts." He stood, moving toward the door. "Rest, heal, get stronger, and when you're ready to talk, really talk, find me." He paused at the door. "You're not alone in this, Siwoo, remember that." He left. Siwoo lay in the silence, the stopwatch warm in his hand, Ji-ho's words echoing in his mind. "You're not alone." For the first time in his life, he almost believed it. Chapter 5, The Whisper of the Ancient One. Recovery took longer this time. 3 seconds of frozen time had cost Siwoo more than he'd realized. The healers clucked over him like worried hens, muttering about mana depletion and cellular stress and things they didn't understand. They kept him in the medical wing for a week, monitoring his vital signs, running tests that showed nothing useful. The stopwatch stayed in his pocket, warm and patient. On the 5th day, Yuna came to visit. She slipped into his room after curfew, her face pale with worry. "I heard what happened. The dungeon, the goblins, everyone's talking about it." Siwoo sat up slowly, wincing at the ache in his muscles. "What are they saying?" "That the cleanup crew was ambushed. That Ji-ho fought off 100 goblins by himself. That you..." She stopped, biting her lip. "That you collapsed from fear and had to be carried out." Siwoo almost laughed. "Fear, if only they knew." "That's the story they're telling?" he asked. "That's the story Ji-ho's telling. He's protecting you." Yuna moved closer, lowering her voice. "But I know the truth. I saw your face when they brought you in. You weren't scared. You were exhausted. The same way you looked after you saved me." Siwoo met her eyes. "You can't tell anyone." "I won't, I promised." She sat on the edge of his bed. "But you need to be careful. Ji-ho's on your side now, which helps. But there are others, people who would use you, control you, hurt you to get what they want." She hesitated. "Like Kyle's father." Siwoo frowned. "Kyle's father? Duke Valerius. He's one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. And Kyle's been telling him about you, about how you cheated during the exam, about how you might have a hidden gift." Yuna's voice dropped to a whisper. "My father works in the palace. He hears things. The Duke is asking questions about you, about your gift, about whether you're really F-rank." Cold settled in Siwoo's chest. "How long?" "A few days, maybe a week. He's being careful. He doesn't want to alert anyone that he's interested. But once he's sure, once he knows what you really are." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Once the Duke knew, Siwoo's life was over. Unless he was ready. He was released from the medical wing the next day. The moment he stepped outside, he felt it again, that gaze, heavy and knowing, watching him from somewhere in the shadows. He turned, and there she was. The librarian. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, ancient and immovable, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When she saw that he'd noticed her, she turned and walked away, slowly, deliberately, as if inviting him to follow. Siwoo followed. She led him through paths he'd never seen, around corners that shouldn't exist, through doorways that appeared only when she touched them. The academy seemed to shift around them, its geometry bending to her will. Finally, they reached a small room hidden deep in the oldest part of the library. Books lined every wall, stacked in precarious towers that defied gravity. Artifacts gleamed in the dim light, ancient things that hummed with power. The librarian sat down behind a cluttered desk and gestured for Siwoo to take the chair across from her. "You've been busy," she said. Her voice was like dry leaves rustling. "The dungeon, the goblins, 3 seconds of frozen time." She smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Impressive, reckless, stupid. Siwoo's heart pounded. "How do you know about that?" "I know many things." She leaned forward, her ancient eyes boring into his. "I know what you are, Lee Siwoo. I know what you carry in your pocket, and I know that you have no idea what you're doing." The stopwatch seemed to grow warmer against his chest. "You're a winder," the librarian continued. "A rare existence, perhaps the rarest in the world. You manipulate the flow of causality itself, not by forcing time to obey you, but by finding the gaps within it, the spaces between moments where anything is possible." She tilted her head. "The stopwatch isn't a tool for stopping time. It's a key that unlocks the doors between one heartbeat and the next." Siwoo stared at her. "How do you know all this?" "Because I was there when the last chronomancer died." Her eyes grew distant, haunted. "I was a girl then, young, stupid. I watched him fall, and I watched him seal his power away, hoping that one day someone worthy would find it." She looked at Siwoo, and for the first time, he saw something human in her ancient face. He didn't expect it to take 500 years. She reached into her robes and withdrew something, a small bracelet, woven from what looked like silver thread, with a single crystal at its center. She held it out to him. "This will help. It's a mana-restoring artifact. Ancient, one of a kind. When you use your gift, it drains you faster than anything should. This bracelet will replenish your reserves, give you more time before you collapse. It won't make you invincible, but it might keep you alive." Siwoo took the bracelet, his hands shaking. It was warm against his skin, humming with a power he could feel but not understand. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you helping me?" The librarian smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Because your biggest threat isn't monsters, boy. It isn't demons or rifts or anything that claws and bites. Your biggest threat is jealousy. The noble families have spent centuries building their power, hoarding their gifts, crushing anyone who might rise above them. When they learn what you are, and they will learn, they'll try to control you. And if they can't control you, they'll kill you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Learn to use your gift, Winder. Learn fast. Because the clock is ticking, and you're not the only one who can hear it." Chapter 6. The Practical Exam Massacre. 3 weeks later, the midterm practical exams began. The entire academy buzzed with anticipation. Students who had spent months training would finally have a chance to prove themselves. Instructors would evaluate their progress. Patrons would watch for new talent to recruit. For Siwoo, it was a nightmare. The exams were mandatory for all students, even maintenance workers like him. He would be thrown into the simulated war zone along with everyone else, forced to survive against waves of magically created monsters. And he would have to do it without revealing his gift, unless he had no choice. The arena was massive, an underground complex the size of a small city, filled with crumbling buildings, narrow streets, and open plazas designed for ambushes. Magic users had spent weeks preparing it, filling it with illusions and constructs that would test every aspect of a student's abilities. Siwoo stood at the edge of the arena with hundreds of others, waiting for the signal to begin. He'd strapped the librarian's bracelet to his wrist, hidden beneath his sleeve. The stopwatch sat heavy in his pocket. Yuna had found him before the exam, her face pale with worry. "Kyle's been talking to people, bragging about what he's going to do to you in the arena. He's gathered a group, the strongest students in our year. They're going to hunt you." "Let them," Siwoo's voice was calm. "I've faced worse. Not like this, not with an audience. If you use your gift." "I won't, not unless I have to." Yuna had looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful, please." The signal came, a massive gong that echoed through the arena. The exam began. For the first hour, Siwoo survived by staying invisible. He moved through the edges of the battlefield, avoiding the main conflicts, slipping past monsters that were too busy fighting other students to notice him. His maintenance training served him well. He knew how to move quietly, how to hide in shadows, how to be where no one was looking. Other students weren't so lucky. He watched groups get overwhelmed by monster waves. He watched individuals fall to ambushes. He watched the arena slowly fill with the bodies of the fallen, not dead. The magic wouldn't allow that, but unconscious, eliminated from the exam. And always, in the distance, he saw Kyle's group. They moved through the battlefield like a tide, destroying everything in their path. Kyle's fire magic was devastating, each blast incinerating multiple monsters at once. The silver-haired girl's ice magic created barriers and traps that funneled the beasts into kill zones. Together, they were unstoppable. And they were searching for him. They found him in the second hour. Siwoo was moving through a collapsed building when the walls around him exploded. He threw himself to the ground as debris rained down, and when he looked up, Kyle was standing in the gap, his hands wreathed in flames. "Janitor," Kyle said, smiling, "I've been looking for you." Siwoo stood slowly, brushing dust from his clothes. "What do you want?" "You," Kyle stepped closer, his friends fanning out behind him. "I want to see what happens when an F-rank tries to survive against real opponents. I want to watch you beg. I want to hear you admit that you're nothing." Siwoo's hand drifted toward his pocket. "Is that all?" Something flickered in Kyle's eyes. Anger, maybe, or confusion. He'd expected fear, he'd expected begging, he hadn't expected calm. "No," Kyle said softly, "that's not all." He gestured, and his friends moved forward. "Hold him." Strong hands grabbed Siwoo's arms, pinning them behind his back. He didn't resist, not yet. He was waiting, watching, calculating. Kyle approached slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You know, my father's very interested in you. He thinks you might be hiding something. A real gift maybe, something worth taking." He reached out and grabbed Siwoo's chin, forcing him to meet his eyes. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to show me your real power, right now. And if it's impressive enough, maybe I'll let you live long enough for my father to collect you." Siwoo said nothing. Kyle's grip tightened. "Show me." Still nothing. "Show me." And then, from somewhere in the distance, a howl. It was different from the other monster sounds, deeper, more menacing, carrying a weight that made the air itself tremble. Kyle's head snapped around, his expression shifting from anger to alarm. "What is that?" The answer came moments later. A shadow wolf burst from the ruins behind them, massive, easily the size of a horse, its fur black as midnight and its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. B+ rank, one of the most dangerous creatures in the arena. And it was hunting. Kyle's group scattered, their formation breaking apart in panic. The wolf lunged, its claws raking through two students before they could react. They fell, unconscious, eliminated. "Form up," Kyle shouted. "Form up, damn it." But it was too late. The wolf was among them, moving faster than they could track, its claws and teeth finding flesh with terrible precision. Student after student fell. Kyle fought, he was A-rank after all, and his fire magic was powerful, but the wolf was smarter than he expected. It dodged his blasts, used the ruins for cover, struck from angles he couldn't predict. And then, in a single terrible moment, it had him. Kyle lay on his back, the wolf's massive paw pinning his chest, its jaws inches from his face. His fire magic sputtered uselessly. He couldn't get the angle, couldn't concentrate with death so close. "Help," he whispered. "Someone help me." His friends were gone, unconscious, hiding, fled. No one came, except Siwoo. He stepped out of the shadows where he'd been watching, his expression unreadable. The wolf's head snapped toward him, a growl rumbling in its chest. "Siwoo," Kyle gasped. "Please, please help me." Siwoo looked at him, at the boy who had mocked him, threatened him, tried to destroy him, at the son of the man who wanted to control him, use him, take his power. And he made a choice. The stopwatch clicked. Time froze. The wolf hung motionless, its jaws frozen inches from Kyle's throat. Dust particles hung in the air like tiny stars. Everything was gray and still and silent. Siwoo moved. He walked to the wolf, studying it with calm detachment. Then he reached down, grabbed its fur and pulled. It was heavy, impossibly heavy, but in frozen time, weight was different. He dragged it off Kyle, pulled it away from the trapped noble, positioned it so that when time resumed, it would be facing away from its prey. 2 seconds passed. He stepped back, breathing hard. 3 seconds. Time resumed. The wolf snarled, confused by its sudden change in position. Kyle scrambled backward, his eyes wild, his chest heaving. He looked around wildly, trying to understand what had happened. And then he saw Siwoo, standing 10 feet away, calm, untouched, watching him with those unreadable eyes. "You," Kyle whispered, "you saved me." The wolf turned, growling, preparing to attack again. But Siwoo was already moving, not with frozen time, just with normal speed, stepping between Kyle and the beast. "Run," he said quietly. Kyle ran. The wolf lunged, and Siwoo activated the stopwatch again. When the exam ended, the story spread like wildfire. Kyle's group had been ambushed by a shadow wolf. Most of them had fallen, but Kyle had survived, and the one who saved him was the F-rank janitor. No one believed it at first. It didn't make sense. How could an F-rank survive against a B+ monster? How could he save anyone? But Kyle wasn't talking. He'd gone silent, refusing to answer questions, refusing to explain what had happened. His friends were the same, pale, shaken, mute. And Siwoo. Siwoo just went back to work. But something had changed. People looked at him differently now, not with mockery, with something else. Curiosity, suspicion, fear. And in the shadows, watching from afar, the librarian smiled. Chapter 7, The Price of a Second. The summons came 3 days later. Siwoo was called before the disciplinary committee, a panel of instructors and administrators who oversaw student conduct. The charge: use of forbidden magic during the practical exam. He stood before them in a small, windowless room, the stopwatch heavy in his pocket. 5 instructors sat at a raised table, their expressions stern. At their center sat the headmaster himself, an ancient man with white hair and eyes that had seen centuries. "Lee Siwoo," the headmaster said, "you stand accused of using unauthorized abilities during the midterm practical exam. How do you plead?" "I don't know what I'm accused of," Siwoo said quietly. "Don't play games." One of the instructors, a woman with sharp features and sharper eyes, leaned forward. "Multiple witnesses reported seeing you move faster than should be possible, faster than any F-rank should be capable of. You were seen confronting a B+ rank shadow wolf and surviving. Explain." Siwoo was silent for a moment. Then, "I got lucky." "Luck doesn't explain. It does when you have nothing else." He met her eyes. "I'm F-rank. My gift is a broken stopwatch. I survived by staying out of the way and hopping for the best. That's all I've ever done." The instructors exchanged glances. They didn't believe him, that was clear, but they had no proof, no evidence, nothing but rumors and speculation. The headmaster raised a hand, silencing the room. "We will investigate further. In the meantime, Siwoo, you are restricted to the academy grounds. Do not leave without permission. Do not participate in any further exams or training exercises until this matter is resolved." Siwoo bowed his head. Understood. He turned to leave, and the world exploded. The rift tore open in the middle of the courtyard. Siwoo felt it before he saw it. A Chinese letter in the fabric of reality, a wound in the world that screamed with impossible energy. The disciplinary room's walls vanished, replaced by chaos. Instructors shouted, students screamed, alarms blared. And through the rift, demons poured. Dozens of them, hundreds. High-rank demons, the kind that should never appear within city walls. They spread through the academy like a plague, killing everything in their path. Siwoo ran, not away, toward. He had to find Yuna, had to find Jiho, had to protect the people who mattered. The courtyard was a war zone. Fire and ice and shadow clashed in every direction. Students fought and died. Instructors fell. The demons seemed endless, pouring through the rift in an unending tide. And then Siwoo saw them. A group of figures moving against the chaos. Not demons, humans, armored, moving with purpose. They weren't fighting the demons. They were using the chaos as cover, hunting something. Hunting him. Kyle's father, Duke Valerius, he'd sent assassins. Siwoo's blood ran cold. The assassins spotted him at the same moment. Their leader pointed, and they moved, fast, trained, professional. They cut through the chaos toward him, ignoring the demons, ignoring everything except their target. Siwoo ran. He dodged through the battlefield, using his knowledge of the academy to stay ahead. But the assassins were faster, stronger, better trained. They were gaining. And then he reached a dead end. A collapsed building blocked his path. Behind him, the assassins approached, spreading out to cut off escape. Above him, the rift crackled with malevolent energy. He was trapped. The assassin's leader stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Nowhere to run, boy. The Duke sends his regards." Siwoo's hand closed around the stopwatch. He could feel it, the power waiting within, the temporal energy ready to be released. But the cost would be immense. More than before, maybe more than he could survive. But the alternative was death, or worse, capture, control, being used by the Duke for purposes he couldn't imagine. He made his choice. The stopwatch began to glow, not the soft light of before, a brilliant, blinding radiance that pushed back the shadows and made the assassins shield their eyes. The hands moved, not just ticking forward, but spinning, blurring, accelerating beyond comprehension. "What's happening?" the leader shouted. "Stop him." They rushed forward. Too late. Siwoo poured everything into the stopwatch, every reserve of strength, every drop of mana, every moment of his shortened life. The bracelet on his wrist blazed, feeding him power, keeping him conscious. And time stopped. Not partially, not for a few seconds. Completely, absolutely, eternally. Chapter 8, Time Stop. Silence. Absolute, complete, deafening silence. Siwoo stood in a world of grey. The assassins were frozen mid-charge, their faces caught in expressions of shock and fury. Behind them, demons hung in the air, their claws extended, their jaws gaping. Fireballs from student attacks were suspended like ornaments. Debris from collapsed buildings floated in place. Everything was still. Everything was his. Siwoo looked at the stopwatch in his hand. It had changed. The rust was gone, flacking away to reveal gleaming silver beneath. The crack in its face was healing, the glass knitting itself together. It was becoming what it was always meant to be. He had no idea how long the stop time would last. Minutes, maybe, hours. He had to move. He walked through the frozen battlefield, a ghost in a paused world. He approached the assassins first, reached into their armor, removed their weapons, disabled their magical artifacts. When time resumed, they would be helpless. Then he turned to the demons. He couldn't kill them all, there were too many, and his strength was already fading. But he could disable them, could freeze them in place, suspend them in moments that would never end. He moved through the horde, touching each demon, pouring a fraction of his power into their temporal cores. One by one, they stopped. Not frozen like the rest, truly stopped, removed from the flow of time entirely. They would hang there forever, trapped between moments, until someone with more power than Siwoo released them. The work took hours, or minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. Time had lost meaning in this frozen world. When he finished, he was exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced. His body screamed, his vision swam. The bracelet on his wrist was dark, its power spent. But it was done. The demons were neutralized, the assassins were disarmed, the academy was safe. Siwoo turned to face the rift, still open, still crackling with energy, but now empty. No more demons emerged. The flow had been cut off. He walked toward it, his steps unsteady. The rift loomed before him, a wound in reality that pulsed with malevolent light. He raised the stopwatch. "Close," he whispered. Time resumed. The world exploded back into motion, but wrong. The demons didn't move. The assassins stumbled, confused by their missing weapons. The fireballs sputtered and died. And the rift screamed. It convulsed, twisted, folded in on itself. The energy that had sustained it was gone, cut off by Siwoos Chinese letter of the demons, by the disruption in the flow of causality. With a sound like reality tearing, the rift collapsed. Silence fell. The battle was over. And in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by frozen demons and disarmed assassins and stunned students, Siwoo stood alone. The stopwatch in his hand gleamed like new. He collapsed. Chapter 9, The Winder's Legacy. Siwoo woke to find the headmaster sitting beside his bed. The old man looked different now, less stern, more thoughtful. His ancient eyes held something that might have been respect. "You've been unconscious for a week," the headmaster said, The healers weren't sure you'd wake at all. Siwoo tried to sit up, failed, settled for turning his head. The academy. Safe thanks to you. The headmaster leaned forward. I know everything, Siwoo. The librarian told me. The chronomancer's legacy. The stopwatch. The cost you've been paying every time you use it. Siwoo's heart pounded. Are you going to turn me over to the Duke? The headmaster laughed, a dry, ancient sound. Duke Valerius is in custody. His assassins talked. His crimes are exposed. His house is falling. He shook his head slowly. No, Siwoo, I'm not going to turn you over to anyone. I'm going to offer you something. He reached into his robes and withdrew a rolled parchment. Official recognition of your true rank. SSS-rank, the first in a century, full scholarship to Astra Academy, access to the deepest archives, training from the best instructors. He held it out. All you have to do is accept. Siwoo stared at the parchment. Everything he'd ever wanted, everything he'd dreamed of, right there waiting for him. But at what cost? The chronomancer, he said slowly. The librarian told me about him, about how he outlived everyone he loved, about how his gift became a curse. He met the headmaster's eyes. Is that my future? The headmaster was silent for a long moment. Then, it doesn't have to be. The chronomancer was alone. He had no one to share his burden, no one to remind him of what he was fighting for. You, he smiled slightly. You have people, Yuna, Jiho, the librarian, even me if you'll have me. He set the parchment on the bedside table. The choice is yours, Siwoo, always has been. The gift doesn't define you, you define it. He stood and moved toward the door. Rest, heal, and when you're ready, come find me. We have much to discuss. The days that followed were strange. Siwoo was treated differently now, not as a janitor, not as a curiosity, but as a hero. Students who had mocked him now bowed as he passed. Instructors who had ignored him now sought his opinion. Nobles who had dismissed him now sent invitations. He ignored most of it. The people who mattered, Yuna, Jiho, the librarian, stayed close. They talked with him, trained with him, reminded him of who he was beneath the power. And the stopwatch changed. Each day more rust flaked away. Each day, the crack in its face grew smaller. Each day, Siwoo felt his synchronization climbing. 70%, 80, 90. At 95%, the chronomancer appeared to him again. Not in a vision this time, in a dream. The ancient figure stood before him in a field of golden light, his expression peaceful. You're almost there, the chronomancer said. Almost ready. Ready for what? Siwoo asked. To face what's coming. The chronomancer's eyes grew distant. The demon lord you felt during the rift attack. He's been watching you, waiting. His seal is breaking, and when it does, he'll come for you, for your power, for the one thing that can truly threaten him. What's that? The chronomancer smiled. You'll find out, at 100%, when the stopwatch is whole again. The dream faded. Siwoo woke with the stopwatch warm in his hand, and the knowledge that time was running out. Chapter 10, The Final Hand. The Demon Lord's invasion began on a clear autumn morning. Siwoo felt it before anyone else did, a tremor in the flow of time, a Chinese letter in causality that signaled the breaking of an ancient seal. He was in the training grounds with Jiho when it happened, practicing acceleration techniques. He's coming, Siwoo said. Jiho's expression hardened. How long? Hours, maybe less. They moved. The academy mobilized faster than it ever had before. Students were evacuated to safe zones. Instructors took up defensive positions. Hunters from across the city gathered at the gates. And at the center of it all, Siwoo waited. The stopwatch was complete now, the rust gone, the crack healed, its surface gleaming like liquid silver. He could feel its power humming through him, could sense the flow of time throughout the city, could see the threads of causality that connected everything. Synchronization, 100%. He was ready. The rift opened at noon. It was massive, larger than anything that had come before, a wound in reality that bled darkness into the world. Demons poured through in endless waves, their shrieks filling the air. The battle began. Siwoo didn't wait. He activated his gift and stepped into frozen time. The world went gray, the demons froze, the chaos stopped. He walked through the battlefield, touching each demon, freezing them in eternal moments. Hundreds fell, thousands. But there were too many. And the demon lord was coming. He emerged from the rift like a god of destruction, massive beyond comprehension, wreathed in shadows that drank the light, his eyes burning with hatred older than humanity. When he spoke, his voice shook reality itself. Chronomancer. Siwoo stood before him, small and alone. Demon Lord, you think you can stop me? You think your little tricks can hold back the darkness? The Demon Lord laughed, and the sound was terrible. I've waited 500 years for this moment. 500 years to consume your power and claim this world for my own. 500 years, Siwoo repeated. That's a long time to wait. The Demon Lord's eyes narrowed. What are you? Siwoo raised the stopwatch. Let me show you something. He activated his gift. Not stopping time this time, something else, something deeper. The chronomancer's final technique, the eternal rewind. Time began to flow backward. The demons retreated, step by step, back toward the rift. The rift itself began to close, its edges knitting together like a wound healing. The demon lord fought against the flow, his power straining against Siwoo's, but it was useless. No, he roared, you'll destroy yourself, the cost. I know the cost. Siwoo's voice was calm. I've always known. The demon lord vanished into the closing rift. The battlefield fell silent, and Siwoo stood alone in the center, the stopwatch dark in his hand, his body translucent, fading. Yuna reached him as he collapsed. No, she whispered, catching him, lowering him gently to the ground. No, no, no. Siwoo looked up at her, and he was smiling. It's okay, it was always going to end like this. You can't just. Tears streamed down her face. You saved everyone, you saved. I saved you. He reached up, touching her cheek with fingers that were barely solid. That's all that matters. The stopwatch in his hand ticked once, twice, 3 times, and then it stopped. Siwoo's eyes fluttered closed. Yuna held him, sobbing, as the world slowly came back to life around them. Students emerged from buildings, staring in confusion at the empty sky where the rift had been. Instructors moved among them, counting heads, checking for injuries, finding none. No one had died. No one except Siwoo. They built a memorial in the academy's main courtyard. A simple stone, carved with his name and the words, "To the one who wound eternity." Yuna visited every day. Jiho came when he could. Even the librarian appeared sometimes, standing silently, her ancient eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The students who had mocked Siwoo on his awakening day remembered him differently now. They told stories about the S-rank janitor who had saved them all. They whispered his name like a prayer, like a legend, like something holy. But Yuna knew the truth. He wasn't a legend. He was a boy with a broken gift and a brave heart who had chosen to give everything for people who had given him nothing. And she missed him every single day. 1 year later, Yuna sat by the memorial as the sun set over Astra Academy. The world had moved on. New students had been awakened. New heroes had risen. The Demon Lord's threat was a memory, a story told to frighten children. But Yuna hadn't moved on. She placed her hand on the cool stone and closed her eyes. I miss you, she whispered. Every day, I miss you so much. Silence. And then, a sound. Soft, faint, almost imperceptible. Dig. Yuna's eyes flew open. The stopwatch lay on the memorial stone. It hadn't been there a moment ago, and its hands were moving. Dig, dig, dig. Yuna reached for it with shaking hands, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. The stopwatch grew warm in her palm, and somewhere in the flow of time, in the spaces between moments, in the eternal dance of causality, a boy who had given everything began to wind his way back home.